I'd been putting the workshop off for 4 years, and I knew it. The rest of the property I'd sorted through in the first 18 months after Dad died. His bedroom, the closets, the barn, even the crawl space under the house where he'd stored paint cans and lumber scraps from 1973. All of it I'd worked through, one weekend at a time, until the only space left was the detached workshop behind the house. The workshop was his in a way the house never quite was. He'd built it himself the year I turned 8, framing it out over 2 weekends in July and finishing the interior that winter. Every shelf was positioned exactly where he wanted it. Every tool hung in the same spot it had occupied for 30 years. The cast iron wood stove in the corner still had ash in it from the last fire he'd burned. I pulled the door shut behind me that November morning and stood in the cold light coming through the single window. The air smelled like sawdust and motor oil and cold space that hadn't been heated in a long time. I'd been here an hour already, working through the shelves one at a time, and I was down to the last corner. The low shelf near the stove held a row of coffee cans, the metal kind with plastic lids, the kind you couldn't buy anymore. Dad had used them to sort hardware, screws in one, nails in another, bolts and washers and wing nuts in the rest. I lifted each can, shook it to hear the rattle, and set it aside. The last can was heavier than the others. I pried off the lid and looked inside. Hex bolts, hundreds of them, packed tight. The kind of thing Dad saved because throwing away good hardware felt like waste. I shook the can and heard the bolts shift. Something underneath them didn't sound right. I tipped the can and worked my fingers down into the bolts until they closed on something flat and rectangular. I pulled it free, and the bolts poured back into the space it left. A cassette tape. Maxwell, 60 Minutes, the old tan and clear kind. The label was in Dad's handwriting. All caps, block print, the way he labeled everything. Do not play this inside, nothing else. No date, no explanation, no other markings on either side. I turned it over in my hands. The plastic case was scuffed but intact. The tape itself looked fine, the leader still wound tight on the left spool. My portable cassette player was sitting on the workbench 6 feet away. I'd brought it out here because I used it for instructional tapes in my shop class at Lance High School, and I'd been meaning to clean the heads. It was a Panasonic, older than most of my students, but it still worked. I set the tape down on the bench next to it. I didn't put them together. The label bothered me. Do not play this inside. The phrasing was specific, not don't play this or outside only, inside. As if the problem wasn't the tape itself, but where you played it. It connected to something I hadn't thought about in years. Dad had one household rule he never explained, never argued, never turned into a story. You didn't whistle indoors after dark. That was it. No reason given. No consequences spelled out. It simply held, the way gravity holds. And I learned it the same way I learned not to touch the wood stove. I broke it once. I was 16, maybe 17. I'd been working on my truck in the garage and I was locking up for the night. I whistled something. A few bars of whatever song had been on the radio that afternoon. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I heard the back door of the house slam open. Dad came across the yard at a run. I'd never seen him run like that. Not when I broke my arm falling out of the hayloft. Not when the barn caught fire from a lightning strike and we had 15 minutes to get the animals out. He crossed that yard in about 5 seconds and he didn't say a word when he reached me. He just walked into the garage, pulled the overhead door down, and sat on the workbench. I stood there waiting for him to say something. He didn't. He sat on that bench for a full hour in silence, and I sat on an overturned bucket across from him, and neither of us spoke. Then he stood up, nodded once, and went back to the house. The rule was never mentioned again. I'd filed it under the category of things Dad was, the silences, the specific habits, the way he approached the world like a man documenting something he couldn't explain, and I'd left it there. But now the tape was sitting on the workbench next to the player, and the label was in his handwriting, and the phrasing matched the rule I'd learned as a child and never understood. I looked at the two objects side by side, the tape, the player, 6 inches apart. I turned off the workshop light and went inside the house. I didn't sleep. I lay in the bedroom in the dark with my eyes open, thinking about the label on that tape, "Do not play this inside," and about the night I'd whistled in the garage. How my father had run across the yard faster than I'd ever seen him move. How he'd sat with me for an hour without saying a word and then walked back to the house like it was over. By morning, I'd made a decision. I went to the kitchen and called my Aunt Kate at her house in Baraga. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice soft and careful the way it always was. "Kate," I said, "it's Atlas. I found something yesterday." I told her about the coffee can, the Maxwell cassette at the bottom of it, the label in my father's block printing. I described the words exactly, "Do not play this inside," and told her the can had been filled with hex bolts, nothing else. The line went quiet for a long moment. I could hear her breathing on the other end, but she didn't speak. "Did you find anything else in the can?" she asked finally. "Just the bolts," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Your father had a habit I always considered eccentric," Kate said. "He recorded himself whistling certain melodies, old Finnish working songs, the kind men used to sing in the forests when they were cutting timber. He stored the recordings in the garage or outside, never in the house." I held the phone against my ear and waited. "Our mother used to say that some songs were not for walls," Kate continued, "that a melody played inside an enclosed space could find the room and stay in it. I never understood what she meant by that, but she said it more than once." "Do you believe that?" I asked. "I believe Nolan did," she said. "That's enough for me to take it seriously." The kitchen was cold. I could feel the draft coming in through the window over the sink, the one that never sealed properly no matter how many times I'd tried to fix it. "Don't play the tape inside the house," Kate said. She didn't tell me not to play it at all, just not inside. "Okay," I said. The line went quiet again, and then it went dead. No goodbye. Just the silence where her voice had been. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after the call. The phrase "not for walls" stayed with me. I thought about what it would mean for a sound to find a room and stay in it. I thought about my father out in the workshop year after year, recording himself whistling and then carrying the tapes outside on purpose, storing them in the garage or burying them in coffee cans filled with bolts. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat there with Kate's words and the image of my father doing that same walk, workshop to yard, over and over, making sure the sound never crossed the threshold into the house. The evening came in clear and cold, low 20s by the time I carried the Panasonic and the tape out to the backyard picnic table, my breath showing white in the air. The moon was half full, bright enough to cast shadows across the snow. The porch light gave the yard a yellow tint at the edges. I set the player on the table and loaded the tape, the plastic case brittle in the cold. Then I sat down on the bench and pressed play. The first 30 seconds were just workshop sounds. Dad moving around in there, shifting something on the workbench. A stool scraped across the concrete floor. The wood stove ticked the way it does when the metal contracts. I could picture him in there, setting up the recorder, checking the levels. Then he started whistling. The melody was slow and wandering, not a song I recognized. It rose and fell without ever settling, circling back toward a phrase it never quite finished. I sat there on the bench and let it go. My breath kept fogging in front of me. The cold worked its way through my jacket. I didn't move. Halfway through, the whistling stopped. Dad's voice came through the speaker, flat and even, the same way he used to describe a busted water pump or a transmission he was working on. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone," he said. "Don't bring the melody inside. The tape is fine. It's the melody that stays, not the tape." Then the whistling started again. It went on like that until the tape ran out. The player clicked off. I sat there a few minutes longer, the cold settling deeper into my hands and feet. Nothing happened. The yard stayed empty. The moon stayed where it was. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and went to bed. At 2 in the morning, I woke to whistling from the backyard. The same melody. The same wandering rise and fall. The same unfinished phrase cycling through itself. I was awake immediately, fully, the way you wake when something is wrong and your body knows it before your mind catches up. I got out of bed and went to the window. The backyard was empty. The Panasonic sat on the picnic table where I'd left it, and the play button was pressed down. The tape was running, but I hadn't rewound it before I came inside. The counter was back at the start. I stood at the window and watched the yard. The whistling kept going. No source, no movement, just that same steady phrase over and over, circling back on itself. The moon had shifted west. The shadows were longer now. The porch light was still on. The whistling stopped on its own. I waited at the window for a while longer, but nothing moved. The yard stayed empty. The Panasonic stayed where it was. I sat down on the edge of the bed and didn't lie back down. I stayed there with my hands on my knees, watching the window until the sky started to turn gray. Atlas sat on the edge of the bed in the gray pre-dawn light, the backyard silent now, the Panasonic visible on the picnic table through the window with its play button still depressed. Over the following week, I heard it 3 more times. The first was Tuesday morning. I was walking to my truck in the driveway, keys in my hand, thinking about the band saw I needed to fix before 3rd period. The whistling started up behind me, close, directionless. That same wandering rise and fall. I turned around, but there was nothing to see. Just the driveway gravel and the house and the workshop beyond it. The sound kept going. I got in the truck and drove to Lance High School without looking back. The second time was at dusk a few days later. I was standing at the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light fade over the property. The melody drifted in from the tree line at the eastern edge of the lot. Quiet, but unmistakable. The same phrase I'd heard on the tape. I stayed where I was and listened until it stopped. Then I went inside. The third was Friday at 4 in the morning. I woke up to it coming from directly beneath my bedroom window, close enough that it should have been a person standing in the flower bed. I checked from the window. Nothing there. Just the porch light throwing shadows across the frozen ground. The whistling kept going for a minute, maybe 2, then quit. I sat on the edge of the bed until the sky started to turn gray. Each time I didn't whistle back. Each time I didn't play the tape again. I went through my days, teaching shop class at Lance, grading, eating, with the melody cycling in the back of my mind the way a song does when it's lodged itself. I didn't try to hum it. I was careful about that. Monday evening, I was at the kitchen table under the overhead light. I had a stack of shop class papers in front of me, red pen in hand. I was grading, or I had been grading. At some point, I couldn't say exactly when, I became aware that I was humming. The melody, the same wandering rise and fall. I was a few bars in before I caught myself and stopped. The kitchen light flickered twice and held. Within under a minute, the temperature in the kitchen dropped sharply. I could see my breath, a thing that should not be possible indoors with the furnace running. I stood up from the table. The chair I'd been sitting in slid backward across the kitchen floor on its own. Not a vibration, not a gradual drift, a single deliberate motion. It stopped hard against the far wall. I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, my breath visible, the chair against the far wall, the papers scattered where the chair's movement had caught the table edge. I picked up my phone and called Kate. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. The humming, the temperature drop, the chair. I was still standing, still seeing my breath. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You brought it inside yourself." I didn't say anything. "Humming the melody indoors is the same as whistling it indoors," she said. "That is exactly what your father was afraid of." I looked at the chair against the far wall, the papers on the floor. I could still see my breath. Kate's voice was quiet. "Your father did the same thing once, decades ago. He spent 6 months getting it out of the house." "How did he do it?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "He never told me. But you need to go back through the workshop more carefully. There may be something there he left for exactly this situation." The call ended. I stood in the kitchen after hanging up. The temperature was still low. The chair was still against the far wall. I didn't move it back. I went back to the workshop the next morning. The cold air bit at my face as I crossed the yard, the frozen grass crunching under my boots. Inside the workshop, it was only slightly warmer. I started at the near wall and worked my way around. Every shelf pulled forward to check behind. Every drawer emptied onto the workbench. The space under the bench cleared out completely. Paint cans, coffee tins full of screws, coils of wire, boxes of sandpaper. Nothing. I moved to the wood stove in the corner. The shelf above it held the usual clutter. More paint cans, a mason jar of wood-stain brushes, a stack of rags. I pulled the paint cans forward one by one. Behind the last row, I found a spiral notebook, the cover stained dark with coffee rings. I lifted it down and opened it at the workbench. The first page was dated 23 years ago. The handwriting was Dad's, the same careful block printing I'd seen on equipment labels and repair notes my whole life. Methodical, exact. The same voice he used to document anything mechanical that needed tracking. The first entry was short. Heard it again tonight. East tree line. Did not go toward it. I turned the page. It stays near the property edge. Does not cross into the yard when I'm outside. Stops whistling when I go inside. Another page. Father called it the follower. Traditional forest signal. Woodsmen used it in Finland to call across distances. Designed to carry. Designed to wait for an answer. I kept reading. The entries covered years. Some were single lines. Others ran half a page. Dad had been tracking it the way someone tracks a failing engine. Observations, patterns, triggers. He called it the follower in every entry. Not a ghost. Not a haunting. Just the follower. One entry from 12 years ago. Brought it inside once. Whistled 3 bars in the kitchen before I realized what I was doing. It entered through the sound. Took 6 months to get it out. Never again. Further down the page, it requires walls. Outside it moves freely but does not attach. Inside an enclosed space it anchors. It stays with whoever called it indoors. Follows room to room. Gets heavier over time. I turned more pages. The entries became more detailed. The melody is not a song. It is a call. It carries through dense forest and waits for the answering phrase. The follower is what happens when the call goes unanswered inside walls. It does not leave until someone finishes it. I stopped on that line and read it again. The follower is what happens when the call goes unanswered inside walls. It does not leave until someone finishes it. I kept going. The notebook was thick, and I was only halfway through. Another entry, dated 9 years ago. The melody wants to be resolved. It has been calling for an answer for 100 years. The follower is what happens when the call goes unanswered in an enclosed space. It waits for someone to finish it. I flipped forward to the last page with writing on it. The date was 3 years before Dad died. I believe I have kept it outside long enough that it has forgotten the interior. Do not let it back in. That was the last entry. I stood at the workbench with the notebook open in front of me. The words were clear. Dad had spent his entire adult life keeping the melody outside because he did not know how to finish it. He didn't know the answering phrase. So he kept it out in the open air where it couldn't anchor, and he made sure I never whistled indoors after dark, and he recorded it onto tapes he stored in the garage so it would stay outside the walls. He had been protecting me from something he couldn't solve. I closed the notebook and carried it back to the house. That evening I sat at the kitchen table and read through it again, slower this time, looking for anything I might have missed. The house was quiet around me, just the sound of the pages turning and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling in the cold. I was halfway through the notebook when the whistling started. Not from another room, not from outside, from directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I turned around. Nothing there. But the presence was unmistakable, a heaviness in the air just off my left shoulder, not visible, not a shadow or a shape, just there, dense and patient and waiting. I shifted in my chair. It shifted with me. I went still. It went still. I stood up slowly and walked toward the front door. The heaviness moved with me, staying off my left shoulder, matching my pace exactly. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. It followed me onto the porch. I walked down the steps onto the frozen lawn. The presence stopped at the edge of the porch. I felt it the moment I crossed onto the grass. The heaviness lifted. The air behind me was just air again. I stood on the lawn in the cold. The temperature was in the low 20s and I wasn't wearing a coat. My breath came out in clouds. I looked back at the house. The porch light was on. The front door was still open. Inside, I could see the kitchen table and the notebook lying where I'd left it. I stood there for an hour. I couldn't stay outside indefinitely. I couldn't leave the house like this. I couldn't sell it. I couldn't walk away. I went back inside because there was nowhere else to go. The moment I crossed the threshold, the presence resettled off my left shoulder. Heavy, stationary, waiting. As I closed the door behind me, I sat back down at the kitchen table. The notebook was where I'd left it. The presence settled off my left shoulder again the moment I pulled the chair in. Heavy, stationary, waiting. I turned back to the first page and started reading from the beginning. Slower this time, more carefully, looking for anything I'd missed the first pass through. Nolan's entries went back decades. The earliest ones were dated from the late 70s when I was a child. He documented everything the way he documented engine problems. Observations, triggers, containment methods. No emotion, no editorializing. Just facts laid down in his careful block handwriting. The melody is not a song, but a call. It enters through sound, requires walls to anchor itself. It follows whoever hummed or whistled it indoors, growing heavier and more present over time. I turned the pages slowly. The presence stayed where it was. I could feel it behind me the way you feel someone standing too close in line at the store. Not touching you, but close enough that your body knows they're there. Near the middle of the notebook, I found the line I'd passed over before. The melody wants to be resolved. It has been calling for an answer for 100 years. The follower is what happens when the call goes unanswered in an enclosed space. It waits for someone to finish it. I read that twice. Then I understood. The presence wasn't threatening me. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. For someone to finish what had been started. For someone to answer the call. I sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The temperature had normalized. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I turned to the last pages of the notebook. There, in the same careful block handwriting, Nolan had transcribed what he believed the answering melody to be. A descending phrase, 4 bars. The notation wasn't musical staff notation. It was a series of arrows indicating pitch direction, up and down, with dots for held notes. Below the notation, in his hand. Worked out over many years. I believe this is correct. I have not tested it indoors. I stared at that last line for a long time. He had worked it out from nothing, over decades, by listening to the follower's behavior, by studying the melody's shape and working backward to what it wanted, what it was calling for. And he had died without ever knowing if he'd gotten it right. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the transcribed answering phrase. The presence remained off my left shoulder, stationary, heavy. I studied the notation. 4 bars, descending, 2 held notes marked with dots. I traced the arrows with my finger, worked out the intervals in my head. Up, down, down, hold, down, hold. I practiced the phrase silently, mouthing the intervals, following the arrows, descending. 4 bars, 2 held notes. I ran through it several times until the shape of it was fixed in my mind. I was aware that if Nolan's transcription was wrong, whistling it indoors might not release the presence but answer the call incorrectly. Anchor it permanently rather than resolve it. Lock it into the walls of the house the way it had been locked into walls for 100 years. I sat with that for a moment. Then I decided. I closed my eyes, ran through the 4 bars one more time in silence, opened them to the notebook and the empty kitchen and the weight off my left shoulder, and decided. I raised my lips and whistled the phrase. 4 bars, slow, descending. The held notes where Nolan had marked them with dots. I kept my eyes open and my hands flat on the table and rendered it as close to the notation as I could manage. The kitchen was completely silent around the sound. When the last note faded, the house went very still. Not quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that happens when something massive stops moving. The presence shifted. It moved from behind my left shoulder to in front of me, crossing the kitchen table. The air in that space became visibly heavier, not darker but denser, the way heat shimmer looks over asphalt in summer except cold and pressing down. A distortion. I could see the edge of the notebook through it, but the lines of Nolan's handwriting bent where the air was thick. I did not move. I watched it. The distortion held. I counted the seconds without meaning to. 20. 30. The temperature in the room stayed cold but steady. The weight in the air did not increase and did not press closer. Then it was gone. The air was just air. The temperature in the kitchen normalized. I could feel the warmth from the baseboard heater against my ankles again. The notebook on the table looked flat and ordinary. I sat without moving for a long time. I could not say how long. Eventually I stood up and walked to the phone on the counter and called Kate. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was cautious. "Atlas?" "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she cried. I held the phone and did not speak. I heard her breath catch and steady and catch again. After a while, she said my name once and went quiet again. "Your grandfather," she said finally. "Mine and Nolan's father. He brought the melody from Finland, but he died without ever passing on the answering phrase. Nolan spent his whole adult life working it out from nothing, from listening, from the follower's behavior, from..." Her voice broke. She steadied it. "He did it for you," she said. "He worked out the answer so you would have it if you ever needed it. He just didn't know if he'd gotten it right." I thought about that, about Nolan sitting at this same table or in the workshop, listening to the follower outside the walls for decades, trying to hear the shape of what it wanted. transcribing arrows and dots in a coffee-stained notebook because he did not read music, building a phrase one interval at a time from silence and waiting and his own memory of the forest. "He got it right," I said. Kate cried again. I heard her set the phone down for a moment and then pick it back up. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm so glad, Atlas." We stayed on the line a while longer but did not say much else. When we hung up, I stood at the counter with my hand still on the phone. Then I walked back to the table and sat down. The notebook was still open to the last pages. The arrows, the dots, the 4 descending bars in Nolan's careful hand. The kitchen was warm. The house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet since before I found the tape. Not empty, just quiet. I sat alone at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the answering phrase and did not move for a long time. I tried whistling on the drive to work the Monday after it all ended. Not the melody. Just a few bars of something I didn't even recognize. The kind of tune you pick up without knowing where it came from and carry with you for years. I raised my lips, drew in breath, and felt my throat close before any sound came out. It wasn't painful. It just wasn't possible. I tried again at a stoplight on the edge of Lens, focusing on the shape of it, the air moving through. Nothing. My throat sealed itself like a door I couldn't open. I stopped trying after that. The shop classroom felt different when I got there. I set my things down on the desk and looked at the Panasonic cassette player sitting on the shelf above the drill press, the one I used to play instructional tapes for the students. I'd used it for years, safety videos, old how-to recordings on joinery and finish work, things I'd inherited from the teacher before me. I left it on the shelf. The students noticed I was quieter than usual. I showed them how to square stock on the table saw and walked them through the setup for dados, but I didn't fill the spaces between instructions the way I used to. One of the boys asked if I was feeling okay. I told him I was fine and moved on to the next station. I worked in silence. The shop was loud enough without me. The hum of machinery, the scrape of wood on wood, the occasional burst of laughter from the back corner where 2 girls were building a bookshelf together. I didn't need to add to it. The days passed. I taught my classes, graded their projects, went home to the ranch house on Scanny Road. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Not empty, just settled. The kitchen table sat under the overhead light the same way it always had. The bedroom window looked out on the backyard and the tree line beyond. Nothing moved that shouldn't move, but the silence followed me everywhere. I tried whistling again a few days later, standing at the kitchen sink washing a plate. Just a reflex, the kind of thing you do without thinking. My throat closed. I set the plate in the rack and dried my hands and didn't try again. The inability didn't pass. I kept expecting it to, the way you expect a pulled muscle to loosen or a headache to fade, but it stayed with me. Every time I raised my lips to whistle, even unconsciously, even the beginning of a breath, my throat sealed before the sound could form. I stopped expecting it to change after the first week. One afternoon I went back to the workshop, not to search it or clean it, just to be in it. The shelves were cleared now, the coffee cans gone, the wood stove cold. The workbench was clean except for a thin layer of dust that had settled since I'd last been in there. The Panasonic was still on the picnic table in the backyard where I'd left it the night I pressed play. I walked out and picked it up, brushed the frost off the top, and brought it inside the workshop. I set it on the workbench next to the spot where the Maxwell tape had been. The tape was still there, right where I'd set it that first morning, the label facing up. Do not play this inside. Nolan's careful block printing, each letter the same height, the words centered on the cassette's paper insert. I looked at it for a long time. I understood now what he'd meant. Not just the instruction, but the weight of it. The decades he'd spent keeping the melody outside. The years he'd spent working out the answering phrase from nothing, the care he'd taken to leave it behind for a son who might never need it. Or might need it and get it wrong. He hadn't known if he'd gotten it right. Kate had told me that. He'd spent his whole adult life working it out, and he still hadn't known. But he'd been right. The answering phrase had worked. The presence had crossed the kitchen table, compressed into a visible distortion in the air, and then it was gone. The house was quiet. The melody was resolved. And now I couldn't whistle. Not the melody. Not any melody. Not even a few bars of something I didn't recognize while I was working or walking or standing at the kitchen sink. Every time I tried, my throat closed. The ability that had resolved it was gone. I didn't pick up the tape. I left it on the workbench where it had been since the beginning, next to the Panasonic, and I turned off the workshop light. The yard was cold under my boots as I walked back to the house. The sky was clear, the stars sharp in the November air, and the tree line at the edge of the property stood dark against the horizon. I didn't whistle on the way. Not because I remembered not to, or because I was trying to keep quiet. I didn't whistle because I couldn't, and because there was nothing left to call.